Hello, this is Emmy speaking, and I will be reading Nightmare Tales by H.P. Blavatsky, A Bewitched Life, as narrated by Quill Pen. It was a dark, chilly night in September 1884. A heavy gloom had descended over the streets of a small town on the Rhine, and was hanging like a black funeral pall over the dull factory burg. The greater number of its inhabitants, wearied by their long day's work, had hours before retired to stretch their tired limbs and lay their aching heads upon their pillows. All was quiet in the large house. All was quiet in the deserted streets. I, too, was lying in my bed, alas, not one of rest, but one of pain and sickness, to which I had been confined for some days. So still was everything in the house that, as Longfellow has it, its stillness seemed almost audible. I could plainly hear the murmur of the blood as it rushed through my aching body, producing that monotonous singing so familiar to one that lends a watchful ear to silence. I had listened to it until, in my nervous imagination, it had grown into the sound of a distant cataract, the fall of mighty waters, when suddenly, changing its character, the ever-growing singing merged into other and far more welcome sounds. It was the low and at first scarce audible whisper of a human voice. It approached, and gradually strengthening, seemed to speak in my very ear. Thus sounds a voice speaking across a blue quiescent lake in one of those wondrously acoustic gorges of the snow-capped mountains, where the air is so pure that a word pronounced half a mile off seems almost at the elbow. Yes, it was the voice of one whom to know is to reverence, of one to me owing to many mystic associations most dear and holy, a voice familiar for long years and ever welcome, doubly so in hours of mental and physical suffering, for it always brings with it a ray of hope and consolation. "Courage," it whispered in a gentle, mellow tone. "Think of the days passed by you in sweet associations, of the great lessons received of nature's truths, of the many errors of men concerning these truths, and try to add to them the experience of a night in this city. Let the narrative of a strange life that will interest you help to shorten the hours of suffering. Give your attention, look yonder before you." Yonder meant the clear, large windows of an empty house on the other side of the narrow street of the German town. They faced my own in almost a straight line across the street, and in my bed faced the windows of my sleeping room. Obedient to the suggestion, I directed my gaze towards them, and what I saw made me, for the time being, forget the agony of the pain that racked my swollen arm and rheumatical body. Over the windows was creeping a mist, a dense, heavy, serpentine, whitish mist that looked like the huge shadow of a gigantic boa slowly uncoiling its body. Gradually it disappeared to leave a lustrous light, soft and silvery, as though the window panes behind reflected 1,000 moonbeams. A tropical starlit sky, first from outside, then from within the empty rooms. Next I saw the mist elongating itself and throwing, as it were, a fairy bridge across the street from the bewitched windows to my own balcony, nay, to my very own bed. As I continued gazing, the wall and windows in the opposite house itself suddenly vanished. The space occupied by the empty rooms had changed into the interior of another, smaller room, in what I knew to be a Swiss chalet, into a study whose old dark walls were covered from floor to ceiling with bookshelves on which were many antiquated folios, as well as works of a more recent date. In the center stood a large, old-fashioned table littered with manuscripts and writing materials. Before it, quill pen in hand, sat an old man, a grim-looking, skeletal-like personage, with a face so thin, so pale, yellow, and emaciated that the light of the solitary little student's lamp was reflected in 2 shining spots on his high cheekbones, as though they were carved out of ivory. As I tried to get a better view of him by slowly raising myself upon my pillows, the whole vision, chalet and study, desk, books, and scribe, seemed to flicker and move. Once set in motion, they approached nearer and nearer, until, gliding noiselessly along the fleecy bridge of clouds across the street, they floated through the closed windows into my room, and finally seemed to settle beside my bed. I noticed the light flashing from under his pen, a bright-colored spark that became instantaneously a sound. It was the small voice of the quill. "Listen to what he thinks. It is going to write," said in soothing tones the same familiar far-off and yet near voice. "Thus you will hear a narrative, the telling of which may help to shorten the long sleepless hours, and even make you forget for a while your pain. Try," it added, using the well-known Rosicrucian and Kabbalistic formula. I tried, doing as I was bid. I centered all my attention on the solitary, laborious figure that I saw before me, but which did not see me. At first, the noise of the quill pen with which the old man was writing suggested to my mind nothing more than a low-whispered murmur of a nondescript nature. Then suddenly my ear caught the indistinct words of a faint, distant voice, and I thought the figure before me, bending over its manuscript, was reading its tale aloud instead of writing it. But I soon found out my error, for casting my gaze at the old scribe's face, I saw at a glance that his lips were compressed and motionless, and the voice too thin and shrill to be his voice. Stranger still, at every word traced by the feeble-aged hand, I noticed a light flashing from under his pen, a bright-colored spark that became instantaneously a sound, or, what is the same thing, it seemed to do so to my inner perceptions. It was indeed the small voice of the quill that I heard, though scribe and pen were at the time perchance hundreds of miles away from Germany. Such things will happen occasionally, especially at night, beneath whose starry shade, as Byron tells us, we learn the language of another world. However it may be, the words uttered by the quill remained in my memory for days after. Nor had I any great difficulty in retaining them, for when I sat down to record the story, I found it, as usual, indelibly impressed on the astral tablets before my inner eye. Thus I had but to copy it and so give it as I received it. I failed to learn the name of the unknown nocturnal writer. Nevertheless, though, the reader may prefer to regard the whole story as one made up for the occasion, a dream, perhaps. Still, its incidents will, I hope, prove none the less interesting.